What do you do when the world stops making sense? When you are thousands of feet in the air, surrounded by nothing but cold metal and the roar of an engine? What happens when your life depends on a machine that can fail for 100 different reasons? None of them your fault. You look for control, you look for an edge, you look for luck. During the Second World War, millions of young men and women were put in situations that defied logic. They faced incredible danger every day. Their training could only take them so far. After that, something else took over. It was a strange mix of hope, fear, and pure, unadulterated superstition. They carried lucky coins, they refused to wash their clothes, they drew cartoons on the noses of their planes. They believed in tiny, invisible creatures that sabotaged their engines. These weren't just quirky habits. They were survival tools. They were mental armor against the chaos of the unknown. Why would a rational pilot talk to his airplane? Why would a whole crew refuse to fly if one man forgot his rabbit's foot? These weren't silly games. They were rituals that provided a sense of power in a powerless situation. They were the bizarre secret rules of a world turned upside down. In number 16, were gremlins real or just a scapegoat for mechanical failure? The pilots in the Royal Air Force had a problem. It was a problem that mechanics could not fix and engineers could not explain. Instruments would suddenly fail, fuel lines would inexplicably freeze at high altitudes, engines would sputter for no reason. In the early days of the war, when aircraft were being pushed to their absolute limits, these glitches were common. But the pilots sitting alone in their cockpits or with their small crews needed a reason. The idea of random catastrophic mechanical failure was almost too much to bear. So they invented an enemy they could blame. They invented gremlins, the idea of gremlins, small, mischievous creatures who delighted in sabotaging aircraft, took hold in the RAF as early as 1923. The term was recorded in a pilot's journal from that year, but it was during the intense air campaigns of 1940 and 1941 that the folklore truly exploded. Gremlins were described in great detail. They had horns, wore tiny boots, and carried tools like pliers and drills to do their work. They were specialists. Some would drink gasoline from the fuel tanks. Others would poke holes in the wings. The most dangerous ones, the widgets, were female gremlins who would distract pilots at critical moments. The belief became so widespread that the Air Ministry in Britain had to take it seriously. They issued a pamphlet in 1942 intended for aircrews that acknowledged the gremlin phenomenon, though in a lighthearted way. It was a tacit admission that the belief was a significant part of pilot culture. One of the most famous people to bring gremlins to a wider audience was the writer Roald Dahl. Before he wrote children's books, Dahl was an RAF fighter pilot. He flew Gloucester Gladiators and Hawker Hurricanes. He experienced firsthand the strange and unexplained malfunctions that plagued pilots. In 1942, while working at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., he wrote a story called The Gremlins. The story was intended for Walt Disney to turn into a film. The film was never made, but the book was published in 1943 by Random House. And Dahl's story was different. He portrayed the gremlins not as evil, but as mischievous beings who were sabotaging British planes in retaliation for the destruction of their forest home, which had been cleared to build a factory. In his version, the pilots could reason with the gremlins and convince them to join the war effort, repairing planes instead of breaking them. The book was a huge success and introduced the concept of gremlins to the American public. The belief quickly jumped across the Atlantic. American airmen stationed in Britain came into contact with their RAF counterparts and heard the stories. Soon, American pilots in both the European and Pacific theaters were blaming gremlins for their own mechanical troubles. It became a shared language of stress. Blaming a gremlin was easier than blaming a tired mechanic or admitting that the plane itself had a design flaw. It was a way to personify the impersonal, terrifying nature of mechanical failure. The psychologist B.F. Skinner, famous for his work on behaviorism, conducted experiments in the late 1940s that shed light on this kind of thinking. In one study, he showed that pigeons would develop superstitious behaviors, like turning in circles or pecking at a certain spot if they were given food at random intervals. They associated their random action with the reward even though there was no connection. For a pilot, the reward was survival. If a pilot checked his engine 3 times and survived a mission where others did not, that ritual was reinforced. Blaming gremlins was the other side of that coin. It was a way to explain the punishment of mechanical failure without losing faith in oneself, the crew, or the machine. The cultural impact was undeniable. Warner Bros. Released a famous Bugs Bunny cartoon in 1943 called Falling Hair, where Bugs battles a gremlin sabotaging his plane. Another cartoon from 1944, Russian Rhapsody, showed tiny gremlins attacking an aircraft flown by a caricature of a German leader. Gremlins were everywhere. They were a joke, but they were a serious joke. They represented a very real anxiety that every single person who flew in a military aircraft had to face. They were the ghost in the machine. What unseen forces did these pilots genuinely believe were at play, beyond the jokes and folklore? How many reports of gremlin activity were actually early warnings of serious, undiscovered aerodynamic or engineering problems that were dismissed as superstition? Did the shared belief in a mythical saboteur actually improve a squadron's morale by creating a common, non-human enemy to rally against? Number 15, why would lighting 3 cigarettes from one match mean certain doom? It is one of the most persistent superstitions in military history. 3 soldiers huddle together. One strikes a match. He lights his own cigarette. He passes the flame to the second soldier. As he moves the match toward the third, one of them will knock it away. 3 on a match is bad luck. The belief was so ingrained in the soldiers of the First World War that it carried over with equal force into the Second. For many, it was not just a suggestion, it was a life or death rule. But where did it come from? The most common explanation is a grimly practical one. It dates back to the trench warfare of earlier conflicts, particularly the Boer War and World War I. The theory goes like this: when the first soldier lights his cigarette, the flare of the match alerts a distant enemy sniper. By the time the match moves to the second soldier, the sniper has had time to aim his rifle. By the time the match reaches the third soldier, the sniper is ready to fire. It is a neat, logical explanation for a seemingly illogical fear. The light is visible for just long enough for a trained marksman to take a life. This story was widely circulated among troops on all sides. It was a cautionary tale rooted in the realities of nighttime combat. However, there is another, more cynical theory about the origin of this superstition. This one has nothing to do with snipers and everything to do with corporate marketing. In the early 20th century, the international match market was dominated by a powerful Swedish industrialist named Ivar Kreuger, often called the Match King. His company, Swedish Match, controlled a vast percentage of global match production. According to some historians, Kreuger's company may have deliberately created and spread the 3 on a match story. Why? To sell more matches. If 3 soldiers could only use 1 or 2 on a match, they would have to strike more matches more often. It was a brilliant, if macabre, piece of early viral marketing. While direct proof of this is scarce, the theory persists. It points to a world where even the deepest fears of soldiers could be seen as a commercial opportunity. During World War II, the belief was not limited to the front lines. It became a part of civilian life as well, a piece of military folklore that came home with the soldiers. In movies and radio shows from the period, the 3 on a match taboo is often referenced. It was a sign of shared experience, a piece of insider knowledge. For the soldiers themselves, it was more than that. It was a ritual of caution. The battlefield was a place of randomness and chaos. Any action that could impose a sense of order, any rule that promised a measure of control over fate, was quickly adopted. Following the rule about the match was a simple, easy thing to do. It cost nothing. But it felt like you were doing something to protect yourself and your comrades. It was a small act of agency in a world where individual agency was often stripped away. The psychologist Richard Sosis has studied how costly rituals build group cohesion. While not lighting a 3rd cigarette is not a costly ritual in itself, it belongs to a category of shared beliefs and behaviors that bond a group together. When a group of soldiers all adhere to the same superstition, it reinforces their identity as a unit. It creates a boundary between us and them. We know the rules of survival. They do not. It did not matter if the sniper story was true or if the whole thing was a marketing ploy. What mattered was that everyone in the group believed it. That shared belief made the group stronger. How many soldiers' lives were actually lost because of this specific sequence of events, or was the sniper theory purely a myth to explain battlefield chaos? If the story was indeed a marketing campaign by match companies, how was it so effectively spread among troops across different nations and languages? Beyond the practical fear of snipers, was there a deeper, more ancient fear of the number 3 that this superstition tapped into? Number 14, could a simple number really decide who lived and who died? 13. For centuries in Western culture, the number has been soaked in bad luck. The fear, known as triskaidekaphobia, has ancient roots. Some trace it to Norse mythology, where the trickster god Loki was the 13th guest at a dinner party in Valhalla, an event that led to the death of the god Balder. Others point to the Last Supper, where Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus, was the 13th person to sit at the table. Whatever its origins by the 20th century, this fear was deeply embedded in the minds of many Americans and Europeans. When these young men went to war, they took their cultural fears with them. In the context of World War II aviation, this fear became incredibly specific and powerful. For bomber crews in the U.S. 8th Air Force based in England, the number 13 was poison. They were flying missions where the odds of survival were already frighteningly low. During some periods in 1943, the chances of completing a full 25 mission tour without being killed or captured were less than 50%. In this environment, anything that seemed to tempt fate was avoided at all costs. Air crews were assigned to specific aircraft, and if that aircraft had the number 13 in its tail code, it was often seen as a death sentence. Some crews would flat out refuse to fly it. Squadron commanders, who were usually practical men, often understood. They knew that a crew flying in a state of fear was an ineffective and dangerous crew. As a result, it was not uncommon for the number to be unofficially skipped. A plane might be designated 12A, or simply go from 12 to 14. The superstition was not just about the planes themselves. The 13th mission of a tour was a moment of extreme anxiety. Crews would be noticeably more tense and quiet on that day. They would double and triple check their equipment. They would hold their Lucky Charms a little tighter. The date was also a source of dread. Flying a mission on Friday the 13th was the stuff of nightmares. The famous 303rd bomb group, known as the Hells Angels, was like many others in its quiet acknowledgement of these fears. While official records do not list superstition as a reason for grounding a crew, memoirs and letters from the men who were there are filled with stories of pilots suddenly developing a cold or mechanics discovering a last-minute engine problem on an unlucky day or for an unlucky plane. This wasn't just about bomber crews. The fear of 13 was widespread. Navy ships would sometimes have their hull numbers adjusted to avoid it. Some military units would skip the number when designating companies or platoons. The phenomenon is a classic example of what psychologists call magical thinking. This is the belief that one's thoughts or actions can influence events in the physical world, even when there is no logical connection. In a high-stress, high-stakes environment like a bombing mission, the human brain craves a sense of control. Since a crewman could not control enemy fighters or anti-aircraft fire, he focused on what he could control, avoiding the number 13. It was an attempt to impose a pattern on a random and deadly universe. The anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski observed this same behavior among the Trobriand Islanders in the early 20th century. He noted that the islanders used extensive magic and ritual when fishing in the dangerous, unpredictable open sea, but used very little when fishing in the calm, safe lagoon. The greater the uncertainty, the greater the reliance on superstition. The fear of 13 became a self-fulfilling prophecy. A crew that was anxious because they were flying in unlucky aircraft number 13 was more likely to be on edge, more likely to make a small mistake. A small mistake over enemy territory could be fatal. So, in a way, the belief in the number's unluckiness could make it genuinely unlucky. It was a psychological trap. The fear itself was the real danger. How many aircraft were unofficially decommissioned or repainted simply because of the number 13 on their tail? Did military commands ever issue official top-down directives to accommodate these superstitions, or was it always handled quietly at the squadron level? Were there any crews that embraced the number 13 as a form of reverse psychology, believing it would scare away bad luck? Number 13, what power did an unwashed piece of clothing hold? A pilot climbs out of his cockpit after a long and dangerous mission. He survived. His crew is safe. His plane is full of holes, but it brought him home. He is covered in sweat, oil, and the grime of his work. He takes off his flight jacket or his worn leather helmet. The next day, before his next mission, he puts on the exact same clothes. He does not wash them. He will not wash them until his tour of duty is over or until his luck runs out. This was a common ritual for countless airmen and soldiers. It was a belief that a piece of clothing, once proven to be lucky, held a protective power that would be washed away with soap and water. The superstition was particularly prevalent among fighter pilots and bomber crews. They would wear the same scarf, the same pair of socks, the same undershirt, or even the same uniform on every single mission. These items became talismans. They were tangible links to success. The logic was simple and powerful. I wore this yesterday and I came back alive. If I wear it again today, I will come back alive again. To wash the item would be to break the chain of luck. It would be resetting the score to zero. The smell and the dirt were not just grime, they were an accumulation of successful outcomes. They were physical proof of survival. The author and pilot Richard Bach, who flew in the post-war era but was deeply connected to the culture of military aviation, wrote about these kinds of rituals. He understood that they were not about cleanliness, they were about continuity. Each successful mission added another layer of luck to the garment. In his book, A Gift of Wings, he captures the mindset of pilots who rely on these personal, often illogical, rules to get through the day. The unwashed uniform was a pilot's personal standard, his battle flag. This behavior can be understood through the psychological principle of associative learning. The human brain is wired to make connections between events. When a piece of clothing is associated with the intensely positive feeling of relief and survival after a dangerous mission, it becomes a powerful positive stimulus. The object itself, a simple shirt or pair of socks, becomes imbued with the emotional significance of the event. It's a form of conditioning. The object becomes a trigger for feelings of confidence and safety. In the face of overwhelming fear, having a lucky item could provide a small but crucial psychological boost. It gave the wearer a feeling of being armed with something more than just his training and his weapon. This wasn't just about individual items. Sometimes entire crews would adopt a similar ritual. They might all wear the same type of regulation hat, or all refuse to get haircuts. These shared superstitions helped to build camaraderie and a sense of shared fate. It was another way of saying, we are all in this together, and we are all following the same rules to keep each other safe. It strengthened the bonds of the crew, which was essential for their effectiveness in the air. The story of the Memphis Belle, one of the first B-17 bombers to complete 25 missions, is filled with the personal rituals of its crew. Each man had his own lucky charms and habits that he stuck to religiously. The unwashed uniform or lucky piece of clothing was a form of armor. It was not physical armor that could stop a bullet. It was mental armor. It helped a soldier or an airman to face the day. And it was a personal, private contract with fate. As long as the ritual was observed, the contract was in force. The dirtier the uniform, the more powerful its magic. Did senior officers ever try to enforce hygiene standards by ordering these lucky uniforms to be washed? And what was the reaction from the crews? How did a soldier decide that an item of clothing's luck had run out? And what was the ritual for retiring it? Were there documented cases where a whole squadron's performance seemed to dip after a group of them were forced to abandon a shared clothing-related superstition? Number 12, why did men paint women on the noses of their warplanes? It was one of the most visible and iconic forms of folk art in the 20th century. On the noses of B-17 Flying Fortresses, P-51 Mustangs, and B-24 Liberators, crews painted vibrant, elaborate images. They painted cartoon characters, ferocious animals, and grim reapers. Most famously, they painted women. They were glamorous, pin-up-style figures, often scantily clad with playful, defiant names. Memphis Belle. Shoo Shoo Baby, a bit of lace. This was nose art, and it was much more than just decoration. It was a talisman, a declaration of identity, and a piece of home carried into the hostile skies. The practice of putting emblems on military equipment is ancient, dating back to the painted shields of Greek hoplites and the decorated sails of Viking longships. But the nose art of World War II was unique in its personal and often unsanctioned nature. It began in the early years of the war, often started by ground crews and pilots themselves. The art was a way to humanize the cold, impersonal machinery of war. A standard issue bomber was just one of thousands. But a bomber with a name and a painting of a beautiful woman on its nose was unique. It had a personality. It was our plane. This act of naming and decorating a plane transformed it from a government-issued tool into a member of the crew. The crews developed a deep affection and trust for their aircraft, and the nose art was the outward expression of that bond. They would talk to the plane, pat its fuselage, and believe that it, in turn, was looking after them. The pinup girl was the most popular subject. These images were often copied from the pages of magazines like Esquire, which featured the famous Varga girls by artist Alberto Vargas. For the young men in the crews, who were overwhelmingly in their late teens and early 20s, these images represented everything they had left behind and everything they were fighting to get back to. They were reminders of wives, girlfriends, and the world of peace, beauty, and femininity that was a million miles away from their daily reality of military life and combat. The pinup was a symbol of normalcy and a powerful motivator. Sergeant Tony Starcer, the official artist for the 91st Bomb Group, was one of the most prolific nose artists of the war. He painted hundreds of planes, including the famous Memphis Belle. He and artists like him were essential to the morale of the bomb groups. Psychologically, the nose art served several functions. It was a powerful tool for identity and group cohesion. The crew of the Memphis Belle were not just any crew, they were the crew of that specific famous plane. It gave them a proud, shared identity. The art was also a form of defiance. The images were often cheeky, aggressive, or humorous. They were a way of thumbing their noses at the enemy and at the ever-present danger they faced. The plane named Satan's Waitin', or Flak Bait, was a statement of bravado, a way of looking death in the eye and smiling. It was a way to manage fear. By painting a menacing figure or a powerful animal on their plane, the crew was attempting to co-opt that power for themselves. The art acted as a kind of modern-day magical symbol, a guardian spirit painted on the skin of their metal beast. The military command had a mixed relationship with nose art. Officially, regulations often forbade it. But in practice, most commanders looked the other way. They understood its importance for morale. As long as the art was not obscene, it was generally tolerated and even encouraged. It was a simple, cheap, and effective way to keep the spirits of the air crews high. The art was a testament to the individuality and humanity that persisted even in the face of the overwhelming conformity of military life. Each painting was a story, a hope, and a prayer. Were there specific images or symbols in nose art that were considered universally lucky or unlucky among different squadrons? How did the artists, who were often enlisted men with no formal training, acquire their paints and materials in a war zone? Did enemy pilots ever specifically target planes with particularly aggressive or famous nose art? Or number 11 was saying good luck. Actually, the worst thing you could say. Good luck. In civilian life, it is one of the most common and harmless expressions of goodwill. You say it to someone before a job interview, a big game, or an important exam. But in the world of soldiers and pilots, and in other high-stakes professions like acting or fishing, those two words could be poison. To wish someone good luck was to invite the opposite. It was seen as tempting fate, as acknowledging the role of chance in a situation where everyone desperately wanted to believe in skill and control. Instead, they developed a whole alternative vocabulary. This phenomenon, known as apotropaic magic, is the use of words or actions to avert evil or bad luck. The most famous example from the world of theater is saying, break a leg, instead of good luck. The logic is that by wishing for something bad, a broken leg, you will trick the mischievous spirits or fates into delivering the opposite. A similar logic applied on the airfields and in the barracks of World War II. Instead of good luck, a pilot might be told happy landings or simply be given a thumbs up. Soldiers heading out on patrol might say, see you later, but never goodbye. Goodbye had a finality to it that was terrifying. See you later was a statement of intent, a promise of return. This linguistic taboo was about managing anxiety. The lives of these men were governed by immense forces beyond their control: the weather, the enemy, mechanical failure. Talking directly about luck was a stark reminder of their own powerlessness. It was like shouting into the void that you were depending on randomness to survive. By creating a set of coded phrases and forbidden words, they created a small island of control. They were following a set of rules that, in their minds, could influence the outcome. If you said the right words and avoided the wrong ones, you were stacking the deck in your favor. The social anthropologist George Gamelch studied the superstitions of professional baseball players. In his famous 1978 article, Baseball Magic, he observed that players had the most elaborate rituals and taboos around the most uncertain parts of their game, hitting and pitching. Fielding, which is a much more predictable activity, had very few superstitions associated with it. This mirrors the experience of soldiers and pilots. The more unpredictable and dangerous the situation, the more they relied on these verbal charms and prohibitions. A clerk in a safe headquarters office did not need to worry about saying, "Good luck." A bomber pilot heading over enemy territory absolutely did. The refusal to say goodbye was particularly poignant. It was a superstition born of love and fear. To say it to a friend was to imagine a future where you would not see them again. It was too painful to contemplate, so the word itself was banished. Saying, "See you for breakfast," or "I'll see you in a bit," was an act of profound optimism. It was a way of collectively willing a positive future into existence. These were not just words. They were spells cast against the darkness. They were a shared agreement to focus only on the successful outcome, to never even speak the possibility of failure into the air. This was also a way to maintain a professional, stoic demeanor. Expressing overt fear or worry was often frowned upon. The use of coded language allowed men to express their concern for each other's safety in a way that was acceptable within the culture of the unit. A simple nod and a "take it easy" carried a huge weight of meaning. It said everything that needed to be said without breaking the unwritten rules of emotional conduct. How did a new recruit learn this complex and unwritten dictionary of safe and unsafe phrases? Were there instances of a soldier being ostracized or considered a jinx for repeatedly using forbidden words like "good luck"? Did these linguistic taboos vary significantly between different branches of the military, for example, between sailors and airmen? Number 10, could a simple coin really stop a bullet? In the pockets of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen, next to their wallets and their letters from home, was a small, flat piece of metal. It might have been a silver dollar, a British penny, or a French franc. It was a lucky coin. For many, this was their most important possession. It was not valuable for its monetary worth, but for the protective power it was believed to hold. The idea of a lucky coin is an ancient one, but in the intense environment of the war, it took on a desperate, life-saving significance. The stories were legendary and passed from one man to another like gospel. A soldier is hit in the chest, right over his heart, but the bullet is deflected by the silver dollar his father gave him. A pilot's instrument panel is shattered by shrapnel, but the one piece that would have hit him is stopped by an old coin tucked into his flight jacket. Whether these stories were true, exaggerated, or complete fabrications did not matter. Their power was in the telling. They provided a sliver of hope, a belief that, a small personal object could intervene in the impersonal violence of war. The choice of the coin was often deeply personal. It might be a coin from the year the man was born. It could be the first dollar he ever earned. Often it was a gift from a loved one, a parent, a wife, or a sweetheart, given just before he left for the service. This added another layer of magical significance. The coin was not just a piece of metal, it was a physical manifestation of the love and prayers of the people back home. It was a connection to the world he was fighting for. Holding the coin in his hand, feeling its weight and its smooth, worn surface, was a way to feel connected to that world, even in the most terrifying of circumstances. This belief in the protective power of objects is a form of fetishism, in the original anthropological sense of the word. A fetish is an object believed to have supernatural powers or to be inhabited by a spirit. The lucky coin was a soldier's personal fetish. He would talk to it, rub it before a mission, and never let it out of his sight. The psychologist Carl Jung wrote about the power of symbols and archetypes. The circle, represented by the coin, is a universal symbol of wholeness, safety, and eternity. The coin, a perfect circle of metal, could have tapped into this deep, unconscious psychological resonance. There was also a more practical though equally ritualistic side to the lucky coin. In some Air Force units, a tradition known as the challenge coin emerged. Though it became more formalized after the war, its roots lie in this period. A member of a unit would be issued a coin with the unit's insignia. At any time, one member could challenge another by slapping his coin down on a table. If the challenged person could not produce their coin, they had to buy a round of drinks. This practice helped to build unit identity and ensured that every man carried his coin with him at all times. The coin was a proof of belonging, but for many, its primary purpose remained a superstitious one. It was their get-out-of-jail-free card, their shield against a stray bullet. The very act of carrying the coin was a ritual that provided comfort. It was something a man could control. He could not control the enemy's actions, but he could make sure his lucky coin was always in his left pocket. This small act of control, repeated every day, was a way of pushing back against the feeling of helplessness. It was a quiet act of faith in a world where faith was hard to come by. How many of the bullet-stopping coin stories have been verifiably proven, and how many are military urban legends? What happened to a soldier's lucky coin if he was killed in action? Was it sent home, buried with him, or passed on to a comrade? Did soldiers from different countries have different preferences for what type of coin was considered the most lucky? Number 9. Why was whistling on a ship a ticket to disaster? For centuries, sailors have had a complex relationship with the wind. In the age of sail, it was the source of their power, their livelihood, and often their doom. The wind was a capricious and powerful force, and sailors developed a host of superstitions aimed at appeasing it. One of the most enduring of these was the taboo against whistling. To whistle on a ship was to whistle up a storm. It was considered a direct challenge to the wind itself, an act of hubris that would be answered with a gale. This ancient belief from the age of sail carried straight into the steel navies of the Second World War. Even on a massive battleship or an aircraft carrier powered by steam turbines, where the wind had no effect on propulsion, the old rules still applied. A young sailor who started whistling a happy tune on deck would be quickly and sternly silenced by an older, more experienced petty officer. The reason was no longer practical, but the tradition was ironclad. It was part of the ingrained culture of the sea. To break the rule was to show disrespect for the institution and the history of the Navy. It marked you as an outsider, a landlubber who did not understand the ways of the sea. The belief had several layers. The most common one was that whistling imitated the sound of a rising storm, and that like attracts like. By mimicking the sound of the wind, you were inviting it to appear. There was also a belief that the wind was controlled by spirits, and whistling could anger them or conversely summon them when they were not wanted. In some maritime traditions, the only person on a ship who was allowed to whistle was the cook, because as long as he was whistling, it meant he was not eating the food. But this was a rare exception to a nearly universal rule. During the war, the superstition took on a new urgency. A storm at sea was not just an inconvenience, it could be deadly. It could scatter a convoy, making ships vulnerable to submarine attacks. It could prevent aircraft from launching or landing on a carrier. It could swamp landing craft during an amphibious assault. In a context where the weather could mean the difference between success and failure or life and death, no one was willing to take any chances. The taboo against whistling was a way of asserting some small measure of control over the uncontrollable element of weather. This is another example of a ritual that reinforces group cohesion. When a new sailor is taught the rule, he is being initiated into the group. By following the rule, he shows that he is one of them. It is a shared secret, a piece of cultural knowledge that binds the crew together. The sociologist Emil Durkheim wrote about the importance of collective rituals in creating social solidarity. The shared prohibition against whistling was a small but constant ritual that reminded every sailor on board that they were part of a unique society with its own laws and traditions. The fear was not just of storms. On submarines, silence was essential for survival. Any unnecessary noise could be detected by enemy hydrophones. While a whistle might not be loud enough to be detected, the culture of silence was absolute. Whistling was a careless, unnecessary noise, and it was strictly forbidden. In this context, the superstition had a very practical, modern application. It was a reminder to be quiet, to be vigilant, and to not do anything that could reveal their position. The old fear of a magical storm was replaced by the new, very real fear of a depth charge. Were there specific tunes or types of whistling that were considered more dangerous than others? How did navies that did not have a long tradition of sailing or were landlocked before the war, adopt or ignore this maritime superstition? Are there any documented naval disasters from the war that were, in the folklore of the sailors, attributed to someone whistling beforehand? Number 8. Could the right breakfast determine the outcome of a mission? For many aircrews, particularly in the American Army Air Forces, the day of a mission began long before dawn. They were woken in the dark and headed to the mess hall for a final meal before their briefing. This meal was often the same fresh eggs and real bacon. On the surface, this was simply the command's way of giving the men a good protein-rich meal before a long and grueling day. But for the crews, it took on a much deeper ritualistic meaning. It was the doomed man's meal. It was the breakfast of champions. It was the taste of life. The tradition of a condemned prisoner being offered a special last meal is an old one. For the air crews, who were facing incredibly high odds of not returning, the breakfast of fresh eggs felt uncomfortably similar. It was a luxury. On normal days, they might be eating powdered eggs or simple rations, but on a mission day, the real eggs came out. This meal became a powerful symbol. To eat the eggs was to accept the risks of the day. Some men could not face it. They would have coffee and nothing else, their stomachs twisted in knots of fear. Others embraced it. They ate the breakfast with a kind of defiant gusto. It was a ritual that had to be performed, a box that had to be ticked before they could face what was to come. Superstitions around food were not limited to breakfast. Many pilots and crewmen had personal food rituals. One might always have to eat a chocolate bar on the flight line before climbing into the plane. Another might refuse to eat a certain food like beans on a mission day, believing it to be bad luck. These rituals, like so many others, were about control. A man could not choose his target or the amount of anti-aircraft fire he would face. But he could choose to eat a candy bar. This small, deliberate act was a way of starting the day with a successful, predictable action. It was a psychological foothold. The famous aviator Jimmy Doolittle, who led the daring raid on Tokyo in 1942, had his own set of rituals. He reportedly always had to have his shoes shined before a flight. Many of his raiders had their own personal talismans and rituals. One of his pilots, Ted Lawson, wrote the book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which detailed the mission. The book and the subsequent film brought the intense personal world of the air crews to the public. The pre-mission breakfast scene is a classic trope in war films, precisely because it was such a significant and emotionally charged moment for the real men. The field of nutritional psychology studies how food affects mood and behavior. While the men at the time would not have used this terminology, they understood it instinctively. A warm, satisfying meal could have a calming effect. It was a moment of normalcy and comfort before stepping into a world of extreme stress and danger. The shared act of eating the same meal also strengthened the bonds of the crew. They were literally breaking bread together before going into battle. It was a final, quiet moment of communion. Beyond the specific meal, the routine itself was the most important thing. Wake up, get dressed, eat the eggs, go to the briefing, go to the plane. This unvarying sequence was a way of domesticating a terrifying experience. It imposed a sense of order on chaos. As long as you were following the steps, everything was as it should be. The superstition was not just in the eggs themselves, but in the faithful repetition of the entire morning ritual. To deviate from it, to skip a step, was to invite disaster. Were there certain foods that were considered universally bad luck across all branches of the military? Did the quality or type of the pre-mission meal have a scientifically measurable impact on crew performance and stress levels? What happened when, due to supply issues, the traditional lucky meal was not available? Did it cause a noticeable drop in morale? Number 7, why did having a woman on a ship spell disaster? It is one of the oldest and most deeply rooted superstitions of the sea. A woman on board a ship is bad luck. The belief stretches back to ancient times. The sea was seen as a harsh, violent, and exclusively male domain. Ships were often referred to with female pronouns. She's a fine vessel, and the thinking was that a ship, as a jealous female entity, would be angered by the presence of another woman on her decks. A woman's presence could also anger the sea itself, which was often personified as a fickle and tempestuous goddess. This was the folklore that sailors carried in their heads for centuries, and it did not simply vanish with the invention of the steam engine. During World War II, this superstition was still very much alive in the navies of all nations. The military was a profoundly male-dominated world, and the Navy was perhaps the most traditional of all the services. The presence of a woman on a naval vessel was rare and often seen as a disruption to the natural order of things. If a ship that had a woman on board, perhaps a visiting nurse, a journalist, or a rare female officer, suffered some misfortune, the whispers would start immediately. It's the woman. She's bad luck. It was a simple, easy explanation for a complex or random event. This belief was not just about mythical sea goddesses. It also had roots in more practical, if sexist, concerns. The presence of a woman, it was argued, would be a distraction to the all-male crew. It would break the discipline and camaraderie that was so essential for a functioning warship. The men had their own rough culture, their own language, their own ways of dealing with the intense pressure of life at sea. A woman's presence would force them to change their behavior, and this was seen as an unwelcome complication. The ship was a sealed, self-contained world, and a woman was an intruder from another world. Despite this deep-seated superstition, the realities of the war began to challenge it. Women served with distinction in all branches of the military, though usually in non-combat and shore-based roles. The Waves women accepted for volunteer emergency service in the U.S. Navy, and the Wren's Women's Royal Naval Service in Britain played crucial roles in communications, intelligence, and administration. As the war progressed, it became clear that women were just as capable and dedicated as men. But the front-line, sea-going roles remained almost exclusively male. There were, however, exceptions. Nurses served on hospital ships, which were often in dangerous waters. A few female journalists, like the famous war correspondent Martha Gellhorn, managed to talk their way onto ships heading into combat zones. These women had to contend not only with the dangers of war, but also with the prejudice and superstition of the crews. They had to prove themselves to be one of the boys, to show that they would not be a distraction or a source of bad luck. The psychologist Carol Tavris has written extensively about cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort experienced when holding two conflicting beliefs. The sailors experienced this. They held the belief that women were bad luck on ships, but they also saw women contributing bravely to the war effort. For many, the old superstition was easier to hold on to. It was a simple rule in a complicated world. It was a way of preserving a sense of tradition and order in a world that was being turned upside down. The ship was their last bastion of the old male world, and they were reluctant to give it up. What was the first official naval policy that allowed women to serve on combat vessels, and how was it received by the male crews? Are there any first-hand accounts from women who served on ships during the war about how they dealt with this specific superstition? Did ships with all female or mixed gender crews in non-combat roles, like transport or hospital ships, develop their own unique set of superstitions? Number 6, was it safer to be clean-shaven or to never shave at all? The face of a soldier is his own. In a world of uniforms, regulations, and conformity, his face and how he chose to maintain it was one of his last areas of personal expression. And for this reason, shaving or not shaving became a potent area of superstition. The beliefs could go in two completely opposite directions. For some, a clean shave every morning was an absolute necessity. For others, a lucky beard was their most prized possession. The clean-shaven camp was often aligned with military discipline and order. The regulations in most armies required soldiers to be clean-shaven. A sharp, clean appearance was seen as a sign of a sharp, disciplined soldier. For many, this daily ritual was a way of preparing for the day's duties. The act of lathering up, pulling a sharp razor across the skin, and splashing with cold water was a way of becoming the soldier. It was a transformation from the sleeping man to the man on duty. For these men, to skip a shave was to be unprepared. It was to be sloppy. And in a combat situation, sloppiness could get you killed. The superstition was that a clean shave was a sign of professionalism, and professionalism kept you alive. This was particularly true for pilots. An oxygen mask needed to form a tight seal around the nose and mouth. Any facial hair could compromise this seal, leading to hypoxia at high altitudes. In this case, the practical reason and the superstitious belief were perfectly aligned. A clean shave was a life-saving necessity, so it became a ritual that was never, ever skipped. To fly with even a day's stubble was seen as a reckless act of tempting fate. On the other side were the beard growers. This was most common in services where the regulations were a bit looser or where men were in the field for long periods, like in some commando units or in the submarine service. For submariners, the patrol beard was a badge of honor. Fresh water was strictly rationed on a long patrol, and shaving was a low priority. The beard became a symbol of the time they had spent submerged, a visible record of their service. It became lucky. To shave it off mid-patrol would be to break the streak, to invite bad luck. The beard was a sign of a seasoned veteran, and it was believed to carry the luck of previous successful patrols. Historian Samuel Stouffer led a massive research project during the war, surveying American soldiers about their attitudes and beliefs. The results were published in the multi-volume work, The American Soldier. While not focusing specifically on shaving, the studies revealed the immense importance soldiers place on informal group norms and beliefs. If the veteran members of a squad all grew lucky beards, a new replacement would be under immense pressure to do the same. And to shave would be to defy the collective wisdom of the group, to mark oneself as an outsider who did not respect their traditions. The decision to shave or not to shave was a personal contract with destiny. The clean-shaven man believed in order, discipline, and preparation. He was putting his faith in the system. The bearded man was putting his faith in a more primal, personal kind of luck. He was letting his experience grow on his face, creating a physical talisman of his own survival. Both were trying to achieve the same goal, to feel a sense of control and to make it through another day. In units that cultivated lucky beards, what was the ritual for shaving them off at the end of a mission or tour? Were there any recorded instances of conflicts between officers who insisted on the clean shave rule and enlisted men who refused to shave their lucky beards? Did the enemy have their own, perhaps opposing superstitions regarding facial hair? Number 5. Did carrying a photo of a loved one make you a target? It is one of the most enduring images of a soldier at war. He is in a foxhole or a bunk looking at a worn, creased photograph of his wife, his children, or his sweetheart. The photograph is his connection to home, his reason for fighting, and his hope for the future. For millions of servicemen, carrying a photo of their loved ones was an essential source of comfort and motivation. But for some, it was also a source of deep anxiety. There was a dark superstition that to carry a photograph of a loved one was to make yourself a target. It was seen as tempting fate. The logic behind this fear was twisted but understandable. To carry the photo was to have too much to lose. It was to be constantly reminded of the life you were risking. The fear was that the universe or fate or some cruel god of war would single you out precisely because you had this precious thing to be taken away. It was a belief rooted in a kind of defensive pessimism. If you did not allow yourself to hope too much, if you did not carry a constant reminder of your happiness, then perhaps you would be overlooked. Perhaps you would slip through unnoticed. This superstition often coexisted with its exact opposite. Many more men believed that the photograph was a protective charm. It was a piece of home that acted as a shield. The love of the person in the picture would watch over them and keep them safe. They would tuck the photo into a helmet liner or a breast pocket, believing it could literally stop a bullet. The famous journalist Ernie Pyle, who spent the war reporting from the front lines with ordinary soldiers, wrote extensively about the small, personal items that men carried. He described how they would show him their photos, telling him stories about their families. For these men, the photos were not a liability. They were their most essential piece of spiritual equipment. The conflict between these two beliefs, the photo as a jinx versus the photo as a talisman, highlights the complex psychology of a soldier in combat. The human mind struggles to find meaning and order in random violence. Some soldiers coped by holding on tightly to their connections with home. Others coped by trying to emotionally distance themselves to become a harder, less vulnerable version of themselves. Refusing to carry a photo was a way of creating this distance. It was a way of saying, I am a soldier now, that other life, the life with family and love, is on hold. I cannot think about it too much, or it will break me. In his book, The Things They Carried, Tim O'Brien, writing about a later war, masterfully explores this idea. He lists the physical and emotional burdens that soldiers carry. The letters and photographs from home are among the heaviest. They are a source of both strength and profound vulnerability. The soldiers of World War II understood this intuitively. The decision to carry a photo was not a simple one. It was a calculation of spiritual risk. This fear was not just about fate. There was also a more practical, if grim, concern. If a soldier was killed, his personal effects would be gone through. The idea of an enemy soldier looking at the picture of his wife or child was, for some, unbearable. It was a final, posthumous violation. By not carrying the photo, they were protecting the sanctity of their family's image, even in death. Did soldiers who refused to carry photos develop alternative ways to keep the memory of their loved ones close? Was the superstition of the jinxed photo more common in units that experienced particularly high casualty rates? Are there any documented accounts of soldiers destroying their personal photos before a major battle, believing it would improve their chances of survival? Number 4, why did pilots talk to their planes as if they were alive? And airman pats the nose of his B-17 bomber and says, "Take care of us today, old girl." A fighter pilot climbing into his cockpit whispers a few words to the instrument panel. A ground crew chief gives the propeller a final, affectionate spin. Throughout the air forces of the war, men formed deep, personal, and often superstitious bonds with their machines. They treated their airplanes not as inanimate objects, but as living, breathing partners. They believed the planes had personalities, moods, and even souls. This practice, known as anthropomorphism, is the attribution of human traits and emotions to non-human entities. It is a common human tendency, but in the high-stakes world of military aviation, it became an essential psychological survival tool. A pilot and his crew were entrusting their lives to a complex assembly of metal, wires, and fuel. To think of the plane as a soulless machine was to be constantly aware of the thousands of things that could randomly go wrong. To think of it as a trusted companion, a living being, was to transform the relationship from one of anxiety to one of partnership. The crews would give their planes names, as seen in the tradition of nose art. These names,
Fist Bell, Enola Gay, Pistol, Packin' Mama, gave the aircraft an identity.
once it had a name, it was no longer just a serial number, it was an individual. The crews would then start to describe the plane's personality. This one was temperamental on takeoff. That one was forgiving and could take a lot of damage. Another was a lucky ship that always brought her crew home. These were not just fanciful descriptions. The men genuinely believed them. The writer John Steinbeck, who worked as a war correspondent with the Army Air Forces, wrote about this phenomenon in his dispatches, which were later collected in the book, Once There Was a War. He described the almost mystical connection between the crews and their B-17 bombers. He wrote that the men felt the plane was a living thing, hostile to all foreigners, but loyal to her own crew. They believed the plane could feel damage, and that it fought to stay in the air, to bring them home, even when it was mortally wounded. The stories of heavily damaged bombers making it back to base against all odds reinforced this belief. It was not just good engineering, it was the plane's will to survive. This relationship was a two-way street. The crews believed that if they took good care of the plane would take good care of them. The ground crews, in particular, felt this deeply. They would work tirelessly in freezing cold and pouring rain to patch up their aircraft. It was a labor of love. They would talk to the engines, coaxing them to work. They felt a personal responsibility for the lives of the aircrew, and they projected this onto the machine itself. The plane became the embodiment of their work and their care. This belief system provided a powerful psychological comfort. It replaced the terrifying randomness of mechanical failure with a narrative of loyalty and relationship. If something went wrong, it was not a random event. Perhaps the plane was in a bad mood or unhappy about a sloppy repair. This gave the men a sense of agency. They could try to cheer up the plane by talking to it or by being extra careful with the pre-flight check. It was a way of managing a reality in which their lives depended on the flawless functioning of thousands of moving parts, any one of which could fail at any moment. Did different types of aircraft tend to be associated with different personalities by their crews? How did a crew decide on a plane's name? And was there a ritual involved in its christening? When a beloved, lucky aircraft was finally decommissioned or lost, did its crew experience a genuine sense of grief? And how did they cope with it? Number 3. Could crossing your fingers really change the future? It is a gesture so common that we barely think about it. A child crosses their fingers when hoping for a treat. An adult does it when waiting for important news. The simple act of crossing the middle finger over the index finger is a universal sign of hope and a plea for good luck. For soldiers, sailors, and airmen in World War II, this simple gesture became a constant, almost unconscious ritual. It was a pocket-sized prayer, a silent appeal to fate that could be made at any moment without anyone else even knowing. The origin of the gesture is ancient and debated. One theory is that it dates back to early Christianity. Before the religion was officially accepted, Christians would use the sign of the cross to recognize each other. To be discreet, they might have simplified this to the crossing of two fingers. The intersection of the fingers was believed to create a powerful Christian symbol that could ward off evil or bad luck. Another theory suggests a pagan origin, where the intersection of the fingers was thought to concentrate good spirits and seal a wish or a pact. Whatever its origin by the 20th century, it was a secular symbol of hope. In the war, crossing fingers was a reflex. A soldier in a landing craft approaching a beach would have his fingers crossed inside his gloves. A bomber crewman watching enemy fighters approach would be doing the same. It was a physical manifestation of a desperate hope. In situations of extreme powerlessness, the body needs something to do. Crossing fingers was a small physical act that felt like it was contributing to a positive outcome. It was a way of focusing all of one's mental energy, all of one's will to survive, into a single, simple gesture. This was not just an individual act. It was often a shared ritual. A pilot might look over at his co-pilot and see him giving a thumbs up with his fingers crossed. It was a silent communication that said, "I'm scared too, but I'm hoping for the best, just like you." It was a gesture of solidarity, the famous EV for victory sign, popularized by Winston Churchill, often morphed into a fingers crossed gesture. The two fingers held aloft for victory were also a plea for the luck needed to achieve it. The psychologist Bruce Hood, in his book The Science of Superstition, explains that such behaviors give us an illusion of control. When we are in a situation where the outcome is uncertain and important, we are more likely to engage in superstitious behavior. The act of crossing our fingers, even though we logically know it has no effect on the outcome, makes us feel less helpless. It provides a small psychological comfort by making us feel like we are an active participant in our own fate, rather than just a passive victim of circumstance. The gesture was so common that it became part of the visual language of the era. It appeared in posters, cartoons, and letters home. A drawing of a cartoon soldier with his fingers crossed was an instant symbol of the hopes and anxieties of the time. It was a gesture that everyone, from the frontline soldier to, the family member waiting at home, could understand and share. It was a tiny, silent rebellion against the chaos of the war, a small act of faith that things would somehow turn out all right. Were there specific situations where crossing one's fingers was considered ineffective or even bad luck? Did soldiers develop more complex versions of the gesture, like crossing the fingers on both hands or crossing their toes as well for particularly dangerous situations? How did this Western superstition translate to soldiers from non-Christian cultural backgrounds who fought alongside the Allies? Number 2, why did a rabbit's foot have to be the left hind foot? Of all the lucky charms and talismans carried by soldiers in the war, perhaps none was more common than the rabbit's foot. A small, furry object, often attached to a keychain, it was tucked into pockets and hung from the instrument panels of airplanes. It was a portable personal source of good luck, but the superstition was incredibly specific. It could not be just any foot. For the charm to be truly potent, it had to be the left hind foot of a rabbit, and for the most powerful magic, the rabbit had to have been killed in a cemetery on a Friday during a full moon. The origins of this belief are deep and complex, tracing back to a blend of European folk traditions and African American folk magic, specifically hoodoo. In many ancient cultures, the rabbit was a symbol of fertility and new life due to its rapid breeding. It was also seen as a liminal creature, one that lived between two worlds, the world above ground and its burrow below. This gave it a connection to the spirit world. The left side of the body has often been associated with the mystical or the sinister. In European folklore, the Latin word for left is sinister. The hind feet of the rabbit were powerful, used for quick escapes, so the left hind foot was a combination of several potent symbols. The association with cemeteries in specific times added another layer of supernatural power. These were places and times where the veil between the living and the dead was considered to be at its thinnest. To acquire a rabbit's foot under these specific spooky conditions was to imbue it with the power of the spirit world. By the time of the Second World War, most of the complex backstory had been forgotten by the average soldier. What remained was the simple, powerful belief a rabbit's foot is lucky. For a soldier facing death, the rabbit's foot was a tangible piece of magic. It was something to hold on to in a foxhole, something to rub before going over the top. The soft fur was a sensory comfort, a reminder of something natural and alive in a world of cold steel and death. It was a classic fetish object, believed to hold a protective power. The belief was so widespread that millions of them were produced commercially and sold to soldiers and their families. The irony of the charm is stark. For the rabbit, the foot was anything but lucky. This dark humor was not lost on the soldiers. It was a kind of gallows humor. The luck had to be taken from something else for it to be effective. This reflected the brutal reality of their world, where one person's survival often meant another's demise. The rabbit's foot was a symbol of luck that had been violently seized. This superstition is a powerful example of what is known as contagious magic, a concept described by the anthropologist Sir James Frazer in his work, The Golden Bough. This is the belief that things that were once in contact with each other continue to act on each other at a distance. The foot, once part of a fast and lucky rabbit, was believed to retain the properties of speed and luck, which could then be transferred to its owner. By carrying the foot, the soldier hoped to acquire the rabbit's ability to successfully escape danger. The rabbit's foot was not just a personal charm. It was part of the shared culture of the GI. If a soldier lost his lucky rabbit's foot, it was a cause for genuine distress, both for him and for his comrades. They might all help him search for it, understanding that his luck was, in a way, their luck. The small furry talisman was a vital piece of the group's psychological armor. How did the mass commercial production of rabbit's feet affect the perceived authenticity or power of the charm? Were there stories of soldiers attempting to acquire a rabbit's foot according to the old elaborate rituals involving cemeteries and full moons? Did soldiers who grew up in urban environments with no connection to hunting or rural folklore embrace this superstition as readily as those from the countryside? Number one, what did it mean to tempt fate? Underpinning all of these individual superstitions, the lucky coins, the unwashed uniforms, the forbidden words, was one great overarching belief. It was the master rule from which all others were derived. It was the belief in a capricious, watchful force known as fate. And the most important thing a soldier could do, more important than cleaning his rifle or following orders, was to never ever tempt it. Tempting fate, or hubris in the language of the ancient Greeks, was the cardinal sin. It was the act of being too confident, too boastful, or too certain of a positive outcome. To do so was to invite disaster. Fate, in this worldview, was a jealous and easily offended power. It would punish arrogance by delivering the exact opposite of what was boasted about. A soldier who said, "This is going to be an easy patrol," was practically guaranteeing it would be a deadly one. A pilot who bragged, "This is my last mission, and then I'm home free," was painting a target on his own back. This belief created a whole culture of studied pessimism and understated language. Men would deliberately downplay their chances of success. They would talk about the future in conditional, uncertain terms. "If I get back," was the standard way of speaking. "Never when I get back." To talk about post-war plans in too much detail was seen as a dangerous act of presumption. It was like buying a ticket for a train you were not yet sure you would be allowed to board. The men of the 8th Air Force called this the last mission syndrome. It was widely believed that the 25th and final mission of a tour was the most dangerous, simply because the men were so close to survival that fate was most tempted to intervene. This fear was documented by war correspondents and historians. Margaret Bourke-White, a famous Life magazine photographer, flew on bombing missions and wrote about the crew's elaborate efforts to avoid jinxing themselves. They would refuse to be photographed before a mission, believing it would draw the evil eye. They would avoid making any definitive statements about the future. It was a constant nerve-wracking exercise in managing expectations and appeasing an unseen force. The psychologist Daniel Wegner studied what he called the ironic process theory, or the white bear problem. If you try not to think about a white bear, you cannot help but think about a white bear. The soldier's world was a massive version of this. The one thing they could not afford to do was be overconfident. This led to a state of hypervigilance about their own thoughts and words. The fear of tempting fate was a way of channeling their free-floating anxiety into a specific set of rules. You cannot control the enemy, but you can control what you say. You can control your own hubris. This belief had a profound effect on the way soldiers behaved. It fostered a sense of humility and a deep respect for the unpredictability of their environment. The veterans were rarely the ones who boasted. They were the quiet ones, the ones who had seen too much to believe in certainty. They had seen confident men die and fearful men live. They had learned that the only rule that mattered was that there were no rules. Their refusal to tempt fate was a sign of this hard-won wisdom. It was the ultimate superstition, born from the ultimate truth of their experience that their survival from one moment to the next was never, ever guaranteed. If a soldier did accidentally say something that tempted fate, was there a specific ritual or phrase they could use to take it back? Did this fear of boasting lead to a culture where genuine successes and acts of bravery were deliberately downplayed or left unspoken? In a world governed by this belief, how did leaders and commanders inspire confidence and morale without being seen as tempting fate themselves?